Okay, our next speaker, Gregarious Narain. And I asked him, really, Gregarious, is that your real first name? And I'd love a name like that. But he said it actually was Greg, but one of his friends gave him that name, and it stuck. I couldn't find it in LinkedIn, but I love it. He's been designing and developing social tools and applications since 2003. He was the first hire at Klout, which is where he was VP of product, and now he's co-founder of a company called Chute, a media platform for developers, publishers, and brands. His mission is help people remember better. Title of the presentation is going to be Out of Sight, Peace of Mind. Gregarious, come on up.
Hi, everyone. So I did some work on the slides, and I apologize for the hangover. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about just sort of like the idea of building a remote team. How do you hire people? How do you grow your team, wherever that might be? So just to give you a little background, right now, today, I manage a team of 16 people in something like 6 time zones. I previously had a dev shop in New Delhi, managed a 30-person team there. And so I can tell you all about the pains in the ass that you will have in the process of doing this. So this is not an easy thing. There is some assembly required, but building a great team is how you build a great startup. It's the #1 way to succeed. Find the right people, and that will make you successful. So, generally speaking, I'm from San Francisco, but this tends to be a common trend everywhere. It's very, very difficult to hire people. Everyone is having a really hard time sort of finding and locating the right people. So, you have to make a decision every day as a founder. Do you want to keep moving forward, or do you want to wait until you find the right person? I'm personally too impatient to just wait, so I try and constantly find people, and maybe there's someone great that I'll find in the process and that can continue to work with them. So what you have to do is think locally, how do I build my business, but now act globally, right? Let's use the resources that are available everywhere. So the #2 problem that you're sort of going to encounter when you decide that you want to build a remote team is, is this something I can even do, right? Is this right for me? And so there's this big question. Could we? Is it possible to build a startup where no one is in the same place? Absolutely, yes. Question is, should we do that? And that really depends, right? And so I like to think about it, there's 3 sort of aspects that you want to think about when you're thinking about when you're evaluating this possibility of expanding your team. So, #1 is the product definition. How far along in the process are you to actually creating the product that you want to do, that you want to make? So early in the process of creating products, when you're in idea phase, you're doing sketches, there's a lot of iteration, there's a lot of change. And that's a very difficult time because the #1 thing that gets in the way is communicating, right? And so if you can't sit next to someone, it's very difficult to try and expect the same kind of quality or level of work that you would get later when there's a lot more definition around that process. So, the other thing is, how easy is it for you to segment your product? Can you break it up into smaller tasks, right? Can you make it easy to sort of process and have separate people work on different pieces of it? And the more you can subdivide those tasks into smaller bits and pieces, the better and more likely you are to succeed with that. Every one of those little arrows is expensive, right? So every time one team has to talk to another, there's an expense that comes with that when you're doing everything remotely. When you're doing everything locally, it's entirely different, right? There's still some expense, but it's not quite the same level. The last thing you have to figure out is, are you prepared culturally to deal with this, right? It's a big stress to have this sort of built into your business. I have to do stand-ups twice a day. I do one at 9:30 in the morning and I do one at 11 p.m. every night. And I have to do that 5 days a week, and then I have to work on the weekends to get ahead so I can deliver everything else for everybody else. So it's a lot of sacrifice, and not all of your employees that are local might actually want to sort of jump into that process either. So you have to evaluate that. Is the right fit there for us? So I'm going to do the ABCs of remote teams. Here's just several lessons that I really think that you need to know and you should probably keep track of. So A, you need to assign the human router. That is the person who will be responsible for communicating information from all the different parts of the team. Now this is not just a project manager, because it's someone who has to also sort of understand all of the pieces, and it's probably the hardest thing to win with. So if you don't have a good router, you will likely have a very difficult time succeeding. B, you need to broadcast hearts and minds. Even though everyone is remote and we're not all part of the same team, you have to create the culture of a team, right? So people need to know what are other people thinking and how are other people feeling, right? And it's really important to sort of create an environment where that can be processed and shared. It's sort of like ants and pheromone trails, right? Like you sort of need to like emit lots of information so that people understand how people feel and what's going on. And like, you know, sarcasm, everything doesn't sort of translate well over IM or Skype or whatever you're using. Not all countries are created equal, right? So some countries are better for different reasons. I personally like, you know, if you're doing hardcore engineering, like Eastern Europe is awesome. If you're doing spec-driven development, I might recommend you go to like India or China. If you're doing design, South America is great. And then there's the other vector of like how far away do you want people to be from you, right? So if you're starting out and you want closeness, then maybe staying with South America from here, whereas only an hour time zone difference is actually really doable, right? But 13 hours sucks, right? You don't want to have to be up every night to manage, you know, your team in India or Siberia or wherever it might be. Design small tests and test people using those tasks, right? So the best way to do this, and what I often do is like, I'll go to like, if I'm using a service like Odesk, I'll design a very small test that's very similar to something I need to do, right? And then I'll give that to at least 3 people just to see how they do it, because what I'm really trying to do is understand and evaluate how they communicate, right? And I tell first-time entrepreneurs this often, especially if they're not software people, you won't know if they're writing good code or not. So it doesn't really matter what the code is. What only thing that really matters is, are you able to communicate with that person? Are they helpful in that process? Do they suggest things to you? Do they communicate well? Look at the process that they use with you, and that's a process that you can look forward to. But if you don't have a great process, you'll be very unhappy very fast. So use that little test to eliminate people quickly. Failure is normal, so there is a lot of turnover when you start doing this. And in fact, you need to fire even faster than you would normally do it if you were hiring people here. If you're hiring people in the States or, you know, at home, you might give them a little more time to figure out if there's a cultural fit, et cetera, right? But what happens over time, when you're dealing with remote workers, you basically have to, you know, start over immediately, because every time you restart, there's sort of a step backwards in that process, right? You lose some time, you have to onboard a new person, and so you need to make sure that the process is good with them, and then expect to fail and just, you know, operate on that quickly. So there's a big problem with this stuff. Everyone asks, like, what do you use? And I'll talk about that afterwards. But there's a lot of tools that are available, but I always tell people that the only tool that matters is the one that people will use, right? So you can try 1,000 different tools, but the reality is that because of the cultural differences, because of all these other things, not everyone will like all of these tools, or they will be out counter to their flow. Developers hate doing anything that's not just committing code, right? Designers don't like, you know, labeling their layers in Photoshop, right? So whatever tools you're gonna use, just figure out what you can get the least friction with and use that tool. And don't worry about anything else, because the reality is that all you need to do is keep the process moving forward. So, about that process. In the beginning, make it as rigid as possible, right? You don't actually want to provide too much flexibility too early, because what it does is it breeds bad behavior, right? It's better to sort of build a process where people are very committed and they're willing to work the way that you hope they would work. And then over time, you can be more lax. You can bend, right? You can have more flexibility. You can say, you know what, we don't need to check in every day. Just shoot me an email, because I actually know you're doing the work and we're communicating well and we're moving forward. So I'm not going to do all of the letters, just in case you were wondering. And here's the last one. So for Z, zero communication is death, right? It is absolute failure. So the only thing that you can count on is that if you are not hearing from your team, then you are failing at moving forward, because zero communication is the only thing that startups have to set themselves apart, right? That's why big companies have a hard time being adept, right? Because they can't communicate quickly. They need to schedule lots of big things. We're small, we're nimble, we should be moving fast. And if you're not able to communicate how you're moving and what you're moving on and what you're doing, there really is no progress to be made. And so if you see this happening, this is when you need to nip it in the bud right away and just sort of cancel out whatever process that is and decide, you know, take a new look and see what you should do next. So some tips. How can we build this team? Like, what are the tools that I've used in the process? How do we hack the process and move forward? Oops, wrong way. So, some hiring hacks. I'll show you 2 places that I've been through that are awesome for hiring people. There's a site called Dribbble. Anyone ever heard of it? Yep. So Dribbble is a community of designers. It's invitation only for the people who can contribute. And what's awesome about Dribbble is that it provides you a look at what designers are working on, not necessarily the stuff that gets published back out to their actual client. So, you know, there's a saying with designers that my first work was great, but then the client got involved, right? And so that process usually tends to whittle down things because there's other constraints that are applied. If you want to see what designers are doing, like what they really can do and what they really like to do, Dribbble is a great way to see exactly what they're working on. And then you can reach out right through the site and contact them and say, hey, you know, I really like your style, and, you know, engage them to start working with you. That's how we found our designer 2.5 years ago. Another really big tool for this is GitHub, which is a great place to find developers. So GitHub gives you a great sort of like resume for a developer. You can see sort of the code, the projects they watch, what open source code they may be writing, what they comment on, how frequently they update, how they code. All that stuff is visible right through GitHub. So it's a great tool if you want to look for a developer. You can use something like that. And so just a small example, when I found a guy, our developer in the Ukraine, he was written a library that would happen to be very useful to what we were doing, and I reached out and just said, hey, this is really cool. We need a library like this. Would you be interested in working on it? And now he's like one of my best employees. So that's how you can hack that sort of hiring process. So I'll give you some other tips for productivity. So definitely tip number 1, we love Dropbox. We use it for everything. But what's great about Dropbox is not only is it keeping everything in sync, it's also giving you notifications. That's part of that idea of sort of there being like persistent sort of presence of what's going on. What are people doing? What are people working on? And so when my designer starts saving our homepage design, I see the file is being changed. So I don't even have to ask her. I know what she's working on because I can see little updates going by of stuff that's being updated. So I can see code changing, I can see docs being written, presentations being done, and I don't have to ask anybody, what are you doing, right? So that's why it's such a great tool with a remote team. Tip number 2 is another app called Sketch. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So Sketch is a great tool because it lets you write on photos, right? So if you're building anything, it likely looks like something. So you just need to do a quick annotation, point at something, and then write some notes. Sketch is an amazing tool for that. We use it all the time. And it also provides a web interface for people to comment around and interact with also. So the last set of hacks are communication hacks. So how do we communicate better? So I'm a big fan of using naming conventions because it removes a lot of questions. You know, you've probably had this argument with someone about, wait, which view are you talking about? And I was like, the homepage front. And then they're like, wait, which one's the front? Right? And so people constantly screw up themselves because they don't know which thing they're talking about, right? And there's so many small little aspects. And internally, someone starts calling the sidebar the right-hand side. And then they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. So what I try and do is develop a system where we standardize as quickly as possible the names of everything and how we'll reference them, and then we use that everywhere, right? So we use a tool called Asana, for example, and we tag all of our tasks with the views. So that way I know which view it goes with. All the files, the PSDs, get named with the same thing. The pages will internally name those files the same way. So by using that consistently, you're just guaranteeing that everyone could be on the same page, and we just keep a spreadsheet with all of the list of all the views that we need to do and all the file naming conventions, and that's how people can learn how to quickly use, and everyone can pinpoint what you're working on exactly. My last hack is to definitely use some form of persistent chat. So we use Campfire, but there's many versions of this. Skype will work also. You know, you can have a room open in Skype and just sort of everyone just chats into it all the time. But what the chat room does is sort of part of that process and making sure everyone feels like part of something, right? If you don't all have an office that you go to, it's very difficult to feel like you belong to something. But so we use these rooms not just for work, but for fun, right? It's sort of like our own little IRC. We can chat with each other, paste in stupid images, and do all kinds of fun things in addition to like talking about work and checking in with each other. And my last one is to cross-publish as much as possible. And again, this goes to creating that DNA of what's happening. So whenever you can, syndicate updates from one tool over to another one, right? So for example, our designer doesn't work with code at all, right? But by her seeing the GitHub commits with the comment from the developer into the campfire in the chat room, she's actually getting awareness of like, what are the developers working on? And my business partner, he's not involved in the product side on day to day. He's sort of doing biz dev and all the other stuff. So he gets to get a feed of all this stuff that's happening, and we push it all to one place, right? So design is going in, development's going in, business is going in, but everyone's able to communicate back to one central hub. And now with all the awesome tools that exist out there, there's lots of ways to ping all these different services and send notifications all into like a variety of places. So Skype is a little harder for that, but otherwise it's a great tool. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take some questions though, because I have 4 minutes. Anything?
Let me get a mic.
Oh, sure.
Would you hear a little bit more about other tools that you use to
Okay, sure. Just asking about other tools that we use. So we use GitHub itself for a lot of our code. So all of our code is hosted on GitHub. And so that gives us a way for doing notifications. GitHub has like a lot of webhooks and other sources so that every time code gets committed, like it gets emailed out. So we use Google Apps as well for all of our email, and we use Google Docs for a variety of our organizational stuff. We've tried like every tool. I think like, in 13 months, I tried 13 tools to try and figure out how to do things. Asana is another tool that we use for our sort of like project management. Like, there's a variety of ways there. I personally like Asana because it's just like a list, and I just like to make lists. So every morning it's like, hey, I need to do these 10 things. And what we found is that over all the iterations with all the different teammates, what's worked the best now is basically having a standing list of, hey, here's what's next. Right? And so I reprioritize that daily. Is something happens with a client and we need them to do something faster, I just move it up on the list and we go through that list. We also use, are there any more questions or? Oh.
Hello? Yeah, confidentiality wise, is that a problem if your team is not local?
Sure. So I had a discussion last night about this. So I think a lot of people really worry about IP, and I think like there are very valid reasons if what you are building is truly proprietary, right? You probably likely need to keep that close. I do think though that most startups overestimate how much protectable IP they actually have, right? A lot of what we're doing is remixing, especially for like in a consumer side, right? So the real business is execution, has nothing to do with code, right? You could give 1,000 people the exact same code and say, hey, go make this a business, and most of them would fail with it. Most of them wouldn't even try, right? So it's something that you may want to think about. If what you're trying to do needs to be private, then it's not ideal to sort of put that out there. Like you don't want to advertise that, hey, I want to build something that does this, and you don't want to write a listing on Odesk, right? But I think like don't let that get in the way of you succeeding unless that's the only thing that is part of your success. But I don't really know that for most startups I found is not really something. I've never had a bad experience in 16 years of doing this where anything has ever made it out. So.
Is it on?
Yeah, whatever.
It's on. Go ahead.
Loud enough. Hello? Okay,
Yeah.
good. So, my company is about recruiting remote people, and one of the biggest questions that always comes to an extension of IP is actually security.
Mm-hmm.
What if a company has security concerns when they need to deal with remote employees? What do you recommend they would do?
So I think it's the same. It's a similar boat, right? Like security is a little tougher, right? Like you can take some precautions, right? But the reality is, like, if you need to transfer keys and whatnot for your servers, there's really no way to do it, right? Except through HTTPS and SSL, right? I think like there is a certain amount of trust, and so if you're not sure about where you're going, then wait, right? That's just what you should always do, right? I think use common sense, but don't overestimate it, right? Like don't overinvest or be overly precautious, because just like dating, if you come out too much or too strong early, right, like it sort of doesn't lead to a great relationship. And so if you start by saying, I don't trust you, and I don't want to give you this information, and I don't want to tell you all the facts, it's hard to sort of build something great.
Totally agree. And that analogy holds across all of the business verticals, not just the trust or security. One more question, anybody? Yes, in the back.
How do you make sure that your programmers are working throughout the day, besides that chat room where you can chat with them?
Sure.
Connect an electric cord to their foot?
So if you use Odesk, they actually do a thing where they screenshot their screen. So like while they're using, where they're logged in, basically when it's billable. So they'll actually screenshot. You can go look at what they're working on. I think like with software though, and particularly like I just ask for lots of commits, right? And I ask for incremental commits. I'm like, it doesn't have to be functional, put it in a branch, right? And so that's sort of how I just treat, that's my metric. I'm like, if there's no commits for 3 days, it's not a good sign, right? And if there isn't commits, then at least communicate to me what you're working on through an email or something else. And so I think like you just have to build the rapport to sort of understand, some projects are going to take a long time to complete, and you just need to be prepared that you won't see activity all the time, but you have to build that trust. Thank you, everyone.
Let's give them a round of applause, guys. Thanks, Gregarious, very
Bye.
much.